Because the Bob Durgan show, I was hosting it on 9/11, and that was quite a day. Art Selby said, "Look at there are two TVs on in the studio all the time. One is on CNN, and the other one I think it rotates: ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox." And we saw the smoke coming out of the building, and I thought immediately, my uncle had lived in Manhattan for over 30 years, and we went up once a month, so I knew Manhattan fairly well. I thought it was one of those little tour planes that was trying to show some folks the skyscrapers, and had just run an errant course and had hit the World Trade Center. But I wasn't thinking the fact that it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful day. It was, the sun was shining, and there was no precipitation, and there's so little chance of that. And then all of a sudden we saw in the distance another plane coming, and we knew right away it was terrorism. And I hardly knew what to say. I said, "Well, we are going to ABC, to Peter Jennings. We'll be back when we can." And we sent everything up to New York. Thank goodness all the transmissions were off the Empire State Building. And we sat there for the next 4 hours and watched things unfold. Then I went to Millersville, where I was supposed to teach classes that afternoon. And I just sent everyone home and said, "Please watch the news. You're part of history right now. Watch it unfold, and we'll see what happens." And certainly our lives have never been the same since 9/11, have they? Yeah, that was I think that was actually the last time that I hosted the show by myself. We were actually in the middle of an interview with Don Bailey just before that happened, yeah, we had to cut that short. Well, I'm here today to talk about, Melanie asked me to come today to talk about a subject I've never talked about, and that's the conventions. I don't have a set speech, so I just jotted down a few notes that I thought I'd share with you today. You know, in this particular presidential season, you find that Hillary Clinton, she had temporarily changed her campaign logo to rainbow colors in support of marriage equality. And of course, her idea of marriage equality is that both partners should be president. That's her idea of marriage equality.
Is there something wrong with that?
both should be president. Donald Trump said the other week that if he is elected, he will probably not talk as much. That's right. If Donald Trump is elected, even he will be speechless. So those are the best jokes I could find, guys. I'm sorry. It doesn't get any better than that. But there were nationwide polls leading up to these two conventions. What do voters think of the candidates? When voters were asked, "What do you think of Trump?" What did they say? Arrogant. When they were asked, "What do you think of Clinton?" What did they say? Liar. And then they asked, "What do you think of Jeb Bush?" And what did they say? Bush. You wonder why he added an exclamation point after his name 3/4 of the way through the campaign. The voters didn't even have another word to describe him other than Bush. So that's perhaps a good example why his campaign was a non-starter. You know, most Americans do not want sinecures. We do not want dynasties. I guess the closest thing we have to dynasties today would be the Kennedys, the Bushes, probably, and now maybe the Clintons. I don't know. We'll wait to see what comes of this election. But we are selecting our presidential nominees. Do you remember how presidential nominees used to be selected? They used to be selected by congressional caucuses. In other words, all the Democratic Republicans and then all the Federalists would meet the caucuses in the U.S. House of Representatives. So you had all the Democratic Republicans would meet privately who were members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and all the Federalists who were members of the U.S. House of Representatives. They'd meet privately, and they'd select their candidates. And that's how our candidates were selected up to the Jacksonian era, up through the 1820s. And in fact, that's why we had this long period of Virginia dominance. I never understood it, even though I went to UVA and I lived in Virginia 9 years. It's only in recent years that I've come to learn Virginia was the most populous state in the colonies. It's one of the reasons why they had so many presidents. They had a population, an electoral college advantage over the other states. But you find that you have, starting in 1800, with Thomas Jefferson, 2 terms of Jefferson, then 2 terms of his neighbor, James Madison, and 2 terms of their other neighbor, James Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams, whose father, of course, was one of the most important Federalist leaders. He realizes that if you want to be in power at this point, you've got to be a Democratic Republican. And then the Federalist Party wanes away after 1816. There are no more Federalist candidates for the presidency. So even John Quincy Adams is a Democratic Republican in 1824. And this is why the Democratic Republican caucus becomes known as King Caucus. They are selecting the closest we have to kings. Of course, things started to change, and they started to change in 1831. This is a year ahead of time. In September 25th, 1831, in Baltimore, the Anti-Mason Party. We never heard of the Anti-Mason Party before, did we? They chose William Wirt, a former U.S. Attorney General, as the candidate for the Anti-Mason Party for the 1832 election. We find that, of course, William Wirt was not successful in that election. And the interesting thing about this is previously Wirt was a Mason, but here, sometime later, he's running as a anti-Mason. Wirt ends up winning 1 state, Vermont. Jackson, of course, won the election, and within 10 years, the Anti-Mason Party disappeared. You find that not only was this the first convention, but this is the first time that a party platform was developed. An official party platform was developed. The Anti-Mason Party I mentioned because there's another connection to central Pennsylvania, and that is there was the second convention they held was in, of all places, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In Harrisburg, December 14th and through the 17th of 1835, the Anti-Masons had their presidential convention in Harrisburg. And anyone remember who they chose as their nominee for president? William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison. Have any of you ever been to any presidential conventions? Joan, Litz, and Ed, which ones were you? Which ones were you guys at? Ed?
I was at Chicago in '68, but as an outsider. I was not my father was a delegate, and that's why I was there.
I've been in awe of him ever since.
Were you saw what went on in the streets?
Some of it. And we traveled from the hotel to the convention center, or in buses that had wire over the windows. The streets were fenced off. You could see over some of the fences demonstrations going on in the parks and on the sidewalks.
It's one of the most memorable and most important of the presidential conventions, certainly in the modern era. I've never known anyone who was there, Ed. You should have told me this years ago. Ed and I go to the same church. I didn't know he was going to be here this morning.
It's not something you mentioned in church.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Joanne, which one were you at?
2008.
Okay, and that was which convention?
Well, it was Obama and Hillary.
Okay, it was the Democratic convention.
Yes,
okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I was only at one, too. I was in 1988, I was in New Orleans to see George H.W. Bush accept the nomination and see Ronald Reagan sort of hand over his control of the Republican Party to Bush Sr. at that point. And it's an interesting experience. I don't know how, certainly Ed saw something and experienced something that is historically memorable in the history of the nation, and Joellen and I perhaps saw something that was more conventional, but it's interesting to be there because you see a microcosm of the nation. I don't know about you guys, but I saw, you see all the leaders and you see all the press. I saw Henry Kissinger getting into a taxi cab. We were eating in the same place with Jerry Falwell, and it was everywhere you looked there was another national leader. So it's an interesting experience. But it's certainly one that we have not seen conventions matter probably since 1976. The two last conventions that were up in the air that I remember were 1976, of course, when Ronald Reagan tried to take the nomination away from Jerry Ford, the sitting president. You might remember that convention. And then, of course, 1964, we all remember, I was only 11 years old, but I remember getting up every morning. I was living in Hershey at the time, getting up every morning, running to get the Patriot News to see what was going on with Governor Scranton, because we were all so excited. Governor Scranton was going to try to step in for Nelson Rockefeller, represent the moderates and the liberals, if you will, in the Republican Party, and try to provide an alternative to Barry Goldwater. And of course, he got started so late in the process, it didn't work out. But do you remember how exciting that was? Most of you, I think with the exception of 4 of you, probably all of you were alive at that time. Do you remember Scranton taking this dip? Why did he have to fill in for Rockefeller? What was wrong? Rockefeller was the was the governor, I'm focusing on the presidency too much, was the governor of New York State and highly successful for over 16 years. Rocky was loved in New York. Why couldn't he get the Republican nomination for the presidency? What was it?
He was divorced.
Exactly. Here he has the same characteristic that Ronald Reagan has, but Ronald Reagan was the first, Ronald Reagan comes much later, in 1980, the first presidential candidate we ever had who was divorced to win the presidency. I remember sitting, I grew up in Hershey, and when I had to go to the Hershey laundry with my parent, with my mother, or my grandmother, and I remember they always had Look magazine, Life magazine, the New York Daily News. And for years, when Rockefeller divorced his first wife, all the publications screamed about this for years. And of course, his second wife's name was what? Happy. And the headlines would scream, "You made me so very happy," says Happy, Rose says Happy Rockefeller. And this just didn't go away. Now, there was a difference between Reagan's divorce and Rockefeller's divorce. Rocky initiated the divorce on his side, but in the case of Ronald Reagan, what was true?
His wife left.
Jane Wyman left him. And why did she leave him?
She didn't want children.
He was a Republican.
I don't know about the children as much. They did have a child together. Of course, that was Maureen. But what was true there was Ronald Reagan at that point was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was traveling not around just the United States, but around the world. He was away from home a lot. And this really bothered Jane Wyman. And finally, it got to the point where they had to part ways. But that was not a divorce that was initiated by him. So maybe that's a difference. And we've not had a divorce president since, I guess. That comes to mind. Well, when we look at the this convention process, there's some interesting things to take a note of. This balloting that we see that'll go on in the Republican Party tomorrow. This used to go on for days. It used to go on for days and days and days, and it would result in ballot after ballot. In 1924, the Democratic Convention, which was held in New York City's Madison Square Garden, had 15 candidates, and the convention lasted 16 days. 16 days, and the United States listened. America listened on radio. This is a new medium for us, and we were captivated by this whole process. There were 103 ballots. Could you imagine? 103 ballots, 16 days, and we find that entire state delegations just packed up and left. They ran out of money, and they couldn't pay their hotel bill anymore. They just left. We find that there were fist fights on the floor of that particular convention. One fist fight involved the governor of Colorado versus the governor of Kentucky, and they squared off on the floor. This was before the very first vote occurred. The party was divided over issues. The party was divided over prohibition. Finally, the two top candidates, Al Smith, who would get the Democratic nomination 4 years later, who was the New York governor. And of course, Al Smith is very important in presidential politics because what is he? When he is the Democratic nominee in 1928, who's his running mate? Oh, it's FDR. It's FDR. But the interesting thing is he is the first candidate, presidential candidate that America ever had that was Catholic, Al Smith. But he was trying here 4 years earlier, and the governor of California was William McAdoo. They both withdraw, so this non-ending process could end, and John Davis, who's the governor of West Virginia, he was given the nomination. The longest balloting by the Republican Party would have been the 1880 convention, which was in Chicago, and there James Garfield won that nomination. He had to fend off an interesting challenge. Who was challenging him? U.S. Grant. Remember? U.S. Grant was doing something that no president had ever done before. What was he trying to do? Ulysses S. Grant in 1880 was trying to do something that no one had done before, and that was he was seeking a third term. He was the first president we ever had who violated the example which was set by George Washington, the precedent. Washington served 2 terms and voluntarily stepped down. All presidents after him did the same thing. Now, when we talk about who violated that precedent, we always say FDR, because of the Second World War in 1940, but it was really Ulysses S. Grant in 1880. But the system was set up in such a way that even the savior of the Union couldn't get his own party's nomination for a third term. Now, he had retired and he was coming back. Of course, you know the story of U.S. Grant. Shortly thereafter, his finances are shattered, and he decides that in order to provide for his family, that he'll do his memoirs. But of course, he's struck down by throat cancer. And so he is writing and he is dictating his memoirs of the Civil War until the very end of his life. I think when he finally finishes his memoirs, you find that he dies within 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks. And who's the person who publishes them for him? Mark Twain publishes them for him and makes them a success. Mark Twain hires Union soldiers. They put on their uniforms and they go from house to house. The first door-to-door book salesman and said, the general's family needs you. Would you please buy his memoirs of the Civil War? And Grant's memoirs are the largest selling book in America from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, with the exception of the Bible. It's the largest selling book in America during that time frame. Last night, two other quick interesting points. The first nominee to ever come, it was interesting that Donald Trump was there last night to introduce his wife, wasn't it? But the first nominee to ever make a personal appearance to deliver an acceptance speech was, does anyone know who that was? It was FDR in 1932. FDR won the nomination in 32 after 4 ballots. You find that FDR appeared for two reasons. One, he wanted to assure that would mitigate the worst effects of the Great Depression. And secondly, of course, he had been struck down by polio. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was on his way to a great career following his cousin, Teddy. But you find that he was struck down in 1921. He's elected governor of New York in 1928. But he does this through deception, doesn't he? The American public never knows that he cannot walk at all and is completely paralyzed from the waist down. And of course, his campaign always, and his handlers always make agreements with all photographers, never take a picture of the president in a wheelchair. I think we have one or two only pictures of FDR in a wheelchair. It's interesting, when we went to make the FDR memorial in the mall in the Capitol, how's he portrayed? In a wheelchair. It's interesting. But FDR appeared in 1932 to accept the nomination and made the most important walk he ever made. He was outfitted with steel braces that went from his waists to his ankles. I don't know how much they weighed. They were very heavy, but he taught himself how to walk, and he did it essentially by throwing one leg forward, planting it, and dragging the other forward, and then either using a cane or taking the arm of his son or of a political aide. And so you had the illusion that he could actually walk and had regained the use of his legs. He walked across the podium by himself. If he had fallen, who knows what would have happened to his political career or to the election in 1932. Well, election 1932, that was maybe a foregone conclusion, but it could have changed history. But he made it across that podium. I think it was 12 feet, and he did it. And the country was relieved. Here's this man who'd overcome polio. We can trust him with the presidency. Another trivia piece, if you will, another interesting tidbit of information about conventions. What cities had the most conventions? Chicago has had over 25 conventions. It's been the city that's had the most conventions. At the beginning of our convention system, it was Baltimore because of transportation. It was an easily accessible port city. But later it was Chicago. Now, Chicago had this convention in 1968, which was beset with some violence, so they've not really recovered their convention, if you will, reputation since that time. Last night, Melanie had asked me to talk about the rules. Well, the rules, you saw it last night. The rules that the Republicans set were changed by Governor Romney in the last election cycle. And what it says is essentially, you find that since the conventions no longer determine the outcome of the process, they've become, they used to be gavel-to-gavel coverage by TV and radio. Now they only cover the evening and only a few hours. But in order to try to keep it within certain time limits, they didn't want the favorite sons being nominated and floor demonstrations by the different states. So Romney put into effect, and his followers put into effect, a rule that you had to have a majority of support within 8 delegations or more to be able to have a nomination or have a nominating speech or floor demonstration. And that cut down on the number of things that happened on the floor, and it cut the time of the convention as well. And this is what you see happened yesterday. You had 9 delegations: Iowa, Washington, Minnesota, Colorado, Maine, Utah, Virginia, Wyoming, and the District of Columbia all submitted a petition to allow a full roll call vote on the adoption of the rules package, and this would have allowed individual delegates to vote against the outcome of their their state, they would have been allowed to vote their conscience. But you find there was a very quick reaction. Trump's organization and the Republican National Committee did some quick whipping. There was a whip operation, and they got the District of Columbia, Maine, and Iowa to withdraw. So you need at least 7 states, and they were down to 6. So that is why Trump will get the full unanimous vote of the convention. And there will be no dissent. And in a way, it's disappointing to many of the delegates go. They may realize that Ted Cruz isn't going to win, or one of the other candidates that they supported might not win, but yet they still felt that they have a say in this most recent rule structure. And that's kind of taken away. And it's all prepackaged, isn't it, for television, for the purposes of television. We lose perhaps a little bit in that process, don't we? Then television, that's a whole subject for another presentation at your next Rotary. So I'm out of time. I'm just getting going. But you're welcome to come to Millersville anytime. I'd love to see you. Thank you for having me this morning.